Why are Russia's battlefield supplies so effing bad? Alright, Battlefield AO nerds, we're gonna talk logistics. Within days of the Russian invasion, the roads to Kyiv were filled with standstill Russian supply vehicles. The Ukrainians picked off these vehicles with ambushes, drone and artillery strikes, which seemed like utter incompetence on the part of Putin's military, and formed our current conception of Russia's logistical capabilities. But what was really going on here? First, I think we have to understand some things about Russian doctrine. Just generally, the challenges of supply lines in armed conflict and how this is played out in the Russo-Ukrainian War. And while there have been changes to the Russian military in the last 20 years, there are many aspects of doctrine, infrastructure, and equipment that date their origin to the Soviet Union. And like most militaries, important aspects of doctrine stem from the lessons of past wars. So much of what guided the Soviet Union was their experience from World War II, and to a slightly lesser extent, their war in Afghanistan. Prior to the Great Patriotic War, the Soviet logistics system, while centralized by district, was separated into 16 different directorates, with little coordination. In response to this lack of coordination, Stalin created a highly centralized Rear Service Directorate in July of 1941, about a month after the start of Operation Barbarossa. One inherent limitation back then was a poor road network. So almost everything had to be moved via rail, and many times by animal. To date, the use of rail and pipelines is the predominant method of moving war supplies to the front. Back then, they had some of the same issues as they were having today. When you depend on rail, you eventually hit the front lines, and those tracks end at the enemy's doorsteps. Your troops are not necessarily close to those tracks, so the supplies must be moved by truck to the front. Especially with non-tracked vehicles, you depend on the roads. Moving heavy tires over mud is a good way to get stuck, which we have seen a ton of in Ukraine. The canalizing of supply convoys to roads makes for some tempting targets, both from the air, by special forces, long-range artillery, and partisans. This is not just a Russian-specific problem. All military forces, especially invasion forces, depend on substantial rear area force protection. To put into plain language, you need fighting forces to protect those supply lines. And if your invasion force is already stretched thin, taking troops off the front line to defend trucks in the rear is a painful decision. The last aspect of Russian doctrine that is pertinent here is that Russians held a belief that most of the war will be fought with the supplies you already have. This manifests in a few different ways. One is that Russia stockpiled very large quantities of ammunition and equipment. And when you don't believe that your industry is able or will need to supply your forces for an extended war, you try to save up slowly and never throw anything away. The Russians also believed that this initial push into Ukraine could be handled with supplies that were carried into the fight by its own offensive forces. This makes sense if you think your major objectives could be captured within a few days. Soviet logistic doctrine had what is called an echelon system. So the first set of an invasion or a counterattack forces would advance with their own supplies until they were exhausted. Then a second, fresh echelon would advance behind them, relieve the forces, and allow the first ones to return for supply. So instead of moving the supplies from the rail stations to the troops, you move the troops to the supplies. In theory, there's nothing wrong with this, but there is one big catch. Modern Russia never had the available forces to create a second echelon. The Russians had basically one chance to capture their objectives in Ukraine, and they failed. Once their initial push was exhausted, Russia was forced to figure out how to resupply these troops. Plan B was a poorly designed attempt to send supplies down vulnerable Ukrainian roads. We know how that went. Next, they decided to pull back all those troops on the outskirts of Kyiv and bring them back to friendly lines, resupply them, and redeploy them in Donbass. Focusing on Donbass had some advantages. One is that area, which is highly industrial, had substantial railway infrastructure, and the rail gauges had continuity with the Russian track, so they could just roll those supplies right into the fight. Thus, we saw the late spring offensive that heavily relied on massive artillery assault, with ammunition being fed from those rail lines. This was only halted by the introduction of HIMARS. The once safe rail stations, or closely located depots, were now being struck by long-range fire. Generally, there are two kinds of logistics mechanisms. They can either pull or push supplies. Pulling supplies is when the frontline units request supplies as they need them. To fill that supply, a responsive logistics system needs to be ready and flexible enough. Pull logistics is what is needed if the supply requirements are dynamic. Warfare tends to create dynamic requirements, meaning that as things change, so do your supply requirements. Push logistics involve sending predetermined supplies down from central hubs to units, and then allowing lower echelons to distribute them, if the supply requirements are predictable. If it isn't, there is a high chance of delivered supplies not aligning with the actual needs on the front line. Russian doctrine usually negotiates logistics with a centralized push format. This aligns with the command philosophy that gives less agency to lower-level commanders and unit NCOs. If you don't trust your lower-level leaders to make decisions, you aren't going to give their requests for supply full credence. The inherent weakness of this has been demonstrated by our witness of Russian units being forced to live off the land, looking for food and water and other supplies among the Ukrainian population. There are other aspects that have impacted the efficiency of Russia's logistics efforts. Compared to Western systems, there's a lack of palletized supplies. Huge amounts of ammunition have been brought to the front in crates and hand-loaded and unloaded. So, some of this may stem from a lack of investment in modern systems, but also speaks to a philosophy that undervalues the freeing up of manpower wherever possible. Given that Russia has a long history of conscription, the availability of this cheap labor might have impaired the military's willingness to sink money into mechanizing the supply chain. These constraints might have been easily handled in a relatively low-intensity operation such as Syria, but have come to be a serious problem in their endeavor to supply the massive front in Ukraine. The Soviet military system depended on the centralized command economy that supported it. Russia no longer spends 10 to 20% of their GDP on military spending. Given this reality, the logistics infrastructure may be incapable of supporting these Soviet-era strategies. Thank you all for watching. These videos take a lot of work, and we're just getting started. Please consider supporting us on our Battlefield AO Patreon page.